The heads of China and the US maintain regular contacts in various forms. China attaches great importance to the proposal of the US to hold a meeting between the two heads of state.
President Biden will hold a bilateral meeting with President Xi Jinping of China. This is the first time that they will meet face-to-face since President Biden became president.
The US should meet China halfway, properly manage differences, promote mutually beneficial cooperation, avoid misunderstandings and misjudgments, and push China-US relations back to the right track of healthy and stable development.
President Biden has made it a priority to keep lines of communication open with President Xi, to responsibly manage the competition between our two countries, and he believes there is no more important channel than that between the leaders of the United States and China.
Joe Biden and Xi Jinping, two presidents about to meet face-to-face, two leaders who represent two worlds that many consider to be on a collision course. Next week, President Biden will hold his first in-person meeting with the Chinese leader. It will take place on the sidelines of the G20 summit, a summit where leaders come together to find, hopefully, common ground. But a meeting of the minds is unlikely and not necessarily in the national security interest of the United States. That is according to the commander of U.S. Strategic Command, Navy Admiral Charles Richard. In a recent speech, the Admiral called for a fundamental change in the way the U.S. thinks about its own defense. He says the Ukraine crisis is just a warm-up and that the big one is coming, the big one being conflict with China. All right, let's talk about the military aspect here and how fit the United States is. And to do that, I'm joined tonight by Brad Bowman. He is the Senior Director for the FDD Center on Military and Political Powers. He's also served in the U.S. Service, and so I'll wish you a happy Veterans Day. Brad, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Let me just go through a couple of quotes here. The first one from the Admiral. He said this: "As I assess our level of deterrence against China, the ship is slowly sinking." I mean, do you agree with him? And if so, where are the biggest water leaks?
Thanks for the opportunity to join you, and thanks for the question. Admiral Charles Richard, the head of Strategic Command, U.S. Strategic Command that oversees America's nuclear deterrent, command, control, and communication system, has served our country honorably for many decades and knows what he's talking about. He's using some sobering language there, I would say, and I think I understand the impulse. I would just flag for your viewers that more than a year ago, he kind of sounded the alarm that China was conducting a, quote, breathtaking expansion of strategic and nuclear capabilities. That's not normal Washington speak, if you will. And when someone in his position says something like that, and here we are about a year later with him giving this speech using words like that, at risk of oversimplifying from my foxhole, when I look at what the United States military is doing, I see us, generally speaking, moving the right direction to try to close the gap between the military we need and the military we have. But almost without exception, we're doing it too slowly. And we seem to be kind of moving at the pace that we did in past years when we could kind of get away with that tectonic pace. And I do worry that Americans and our allies, and dare I use the word free world, will suffer if we don't understand that we can no longer conduct business as usual, that in many ways Beijing is sprinting and we're slumbering, and we need to wake up and move a heck of a lot faster than we are up to this point.
Yeah, I mean, the Admiral said that a rethink may require looking back maybe 60 to 70 years. He's quoted as saying, we used to know how to move fast, and we have lost the art of that. I mean, what exactly is he talking about there?
If you go back and look at America's history with World War II and getting geared up for World War II, competing and fighting in World War II and during the Cold War, you have extraordinary instances where we went from almost nothing to just truly becoming the arsenal of democracy in a way that makes me proud as an American. But when I ask myself, could we replicate that today? I'm not so sure, and that's a scary answer for me. And when you look at his particular portfolio, nuclear deterrence, you look at our ICBMs, our intercontinental ballistic missiles, we're relying on Minuteman IIIs, which are half a century old, were intended for a decade or so. And we've been nursing them along, and he's been warning we can't nurse these along any longer. Yeah, its replacement is coming, but it's coming slowly with delays. Look at the Ohio-class submarines, the sea leg of our nuclear deterrent. We've nursed that as long as we can. We have to replace those. You can't extend them any longer. And yet, we're taking a little bit longer than we should on bringing the replacement online, and the B-21 strategic raider, the bomber. So the list goes on and on. Meanwhile, Beijing is, moving to have an extraordinary triad knitted together ASAP, and one has to be worried about the lessons they're drawing from Ukraine and how they could potentially conduct aggression in the Taiwan Strait and then rattle their nuclear saber and get us to back down. And so these issues are more connected, I think, than most people realize.
The Admiral also said that the U.S. needs to find, I mean, you're alluding to this, the can-do spirit that it had when it decided to put a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. And there, he's not, if I understand him correctly, he's not talking about money, he's not talking about policies, he's talking about people and attitudes. How do you change that, Bradley? I mean, you've been in the military.
It's a great question. A lot of the things that slow us down from going to concept or requirement to fielded combat capability, these are not evil or nefarious things. They're processes and boxes to be checked that are put there for good reason, to avoid wasting money and to solicit fair competition and get the best result we can. But sometimes you just can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And we're now entering a world where instead of having one peer nuclear adversary, we're going to have two. And if he's right, and he is, that China is conducting a nuclear breakout, we don't have a strategic treaty with China. So there's no verification or transparency elements, and they won't even often return our calls. And that's going to be one of the issues in the Xi-Biden meeting. It's like, hey, we've got to establish these mechanisms to avoid miscalculation, given the stakes. If you're going to arm to the teeth with nuclear weapons, maybe you should at least pick up our calls when we call to try to avoid miscalculation and increased risk.
Yeah, well, what you say is fascinating, and it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that meeting between the U.S. president and the Chinese president next week. As always, Brad, we appreciate your time and your insights. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. You too.